Thank you. Well, we spent quite a lot of time so far looking at men's graves and distinguished by prestige, weapons and regalia. Now it's the turn of the ladies. In this lecture, I'll be looking at the female graves of the early Metal Age and all those that contain ornament suites, for these are not always the same thing. They are every bit as rewarding for interpretation of this period. Again, we find variety in materials, construction and context, and it is clear that there is a matching dynamism to that I have documented for the male death personae. The repertoire is rich and diverse, and although some ornament types are largely excluded from funerary contexts, particularly Irish prevalent types such as the lunula, the majority do occur in graves. Indeed, ornaments and ornamental fittings were placed in graves right from the beginning of our Metal Age. Some, and perhaps all, would have had a background in the early beaker cultures of mainland Europe, although by no means all have precise parallels there, and there was clearly rapid insular deviation in styles. Now, while I'm not going to give you a case study today on the earliest ornaments, those of Chalcolithic date, it is important to start by illustrating, on the one hand, their diversity in this and the succeeding slides, and on the other hand, their almost universally unspectacular form. There were beads of various materials: copper, gold, shale, jet and amber. You can see various examples on the left of the slide. All seem to be small discs or cylindrical tubular forms. There are occasional pins of copper or bone, examples on the right. There's the familiar early gold sheet trinkets, the basket ornaments once called earrings but probably worn in some other way around the head, and discs with cruciform design or just concentric circles. One past suggestion is that the latter were button covers, and one can see the strength of that argument from the comparison with the currently unique bone button from ALE in the top right. Not quite the top right, sorry, second in. There are also a few disc pendants in bone or stone, two of them groove decorated. Then there is a unique set of copper rings from Radley that we've already seen, and a boar's tusk pendant from Bulsford G1. Now, V-board buttons are not really a feature of the Chalcolithic, but the Driffield find suggests their introduction towards its close. That's the bottom right. Other rings are thought mainly to be belt fittings and range from very simple to more elaborate designs. They occur in amber, jet, shale, and predominantly in bone. This slide also shows, in the bottom row, toggles in bone or ivory. Two main forms start in this early period: tube toggles and rod toggles, their modes for attachment being different. And then, a bit different, there are also three finds of neck rings, which, being made of copper, presumably date to the Chalcolithic. As well as the pair in the Lumfannon hoard, there are two occurrences in graves, although sadly in neither case do we know anything of the body. These neck rings mark a departure from the rest of the ornamental gear of the Chalcolithic in consuming greater quantities of a scarce material. They also appear to prelude the emergence of lunulae, when these islands were always of gold. They have spatulate terminals in common, but on the lunulae the intervening bar has been beaten out into a thin crescentic plate. The contexts of lunulae rarely give us clues as to their dating. Remember, they are never in graves and only rarely occur with other datable objects. They were certainly current by the earlier half of period 2 and may have been developed or refined in Ireland late in period 1. Once lunulae existed, we see the rapid development in Britain of further spectacular and technologically demanding jewellery, and this change is associated with another important transition. The early trinkets, with one exception, all seem to have accompanied men. The exception is the grave of a child and an infant at Radley Barrow Hills that I featured in Lecture 1 for other reasons. The lack of association with women is not because females were excluded from formal burial during the Chalcolithic. However, they were rarely accompanied by any distinctive objects other than a beaker pot, just occasionally with a copper awl or other tool. This association pattern changes dramatically as we move into period 2. Suddenly, we start to see the appearance of women's graves furnished with objects that seem to imply more opulence, notably new versions of neck ornaments and stylistically matching bracelets or armlets. Taken at face value, this evidence would seem to signal the elevation of certain women to a higher status than they had hitherto been eligible for. But we need to give thought also to the possibility that this change instead reflected how significant women should be presented to the other world. One correlation, though, seems clear. This distinctive female burial mode appears at the same horizon as the step change in ostentation and complexity of ornaments, especially neck ornaments. They are tied together. So even if women were unchanged in status across this transition, their apparel was certainly upgraded. We will return at the end to discuss possible causes for this crucial change in funerary presentations. Before progressing further with this question, we need to step back a bit. The term ornaments is always a tricky one. It can embrace so much. Many elements of material culture can be made ornamental, that is, being given features and finishes that go beyond the bare requirements of the object's function. Aspects of style lead imperceptibly into ornamentation. The early Metal Age is no different to most other periods in this respect. We have seen in an earlier lecture, for example, that dagger hilts can be made ornate and the whole dagger and sheath were effectively ornamental regalia, even when they were still perfectly usable weapons. Likewise, we could think of braces as ornaments in the broad sense. The finely polished stone examples we encounter in graves are effectively ornamental display pieces, whether mounted on a functional organic wrist protector or not. So we need to break down the ornamental repertoire insofar as that is possible, given many ambiguities in function. Although interpreting function is actually one of the big uncertainties of the ornamental paraphernalia of this age, we can nevertheless be confident of the existence of certain broad categories. Firstly, there are body ornaments, that is, ones that were free from garments. Secondly, there's clothing fasteners. Thirdly, clothing spangles, in other words, appliques and sequins, which are fixed to clothing. And fourthly, ornamental appendages to other objects. I will not deal further with category 4 in this lecture. Further complications in the definition of ornaments can arise from secondary use. This can be illustrated nicely, for example, by Anne Woodward's suggestion that some dagger and knife pommels may have latterly come to be strung with the sets of beads and pendants with which they were found. Such a transformation in use state is fascinating, if somewhat bedeviling, and other functional fittings could, of course, from time to time have ended up strung, suspended or mounted as ornaments. The distinction between clothing fasteners and clothing spangles would be obvious if we had the full costume set, but of course that never survives. And positions around the skeleton can be ambiguous. Working from logic and the morphology and wear patterns of the objects, it seems likely that spangles in the form of both sequins and appliques were a feature of this period. Alison Sheridan, for example, has reconstructed the Nauza Trotty ornaments in this manner, on a cape-like garment in an arrangement inspired by the mould cape. She envisages both appliques and sequins to be present, in this case the sequins forming a fringe. We'll see a little bit more of mould in a moment. Meanwhile, one plausible interpretation of the few large gold sheet covers of Wessex type is that the plaques they covered were no longer functional fasteners, but had become mere appliques. This is an illustration of how a functional and yet socially significant form within the normal costume set might be aggrandized to become non-functional regalia. It still served to represent a given type of fastener and all it stood for culturally, but it had been elevated to denote a very different status. And in serving this new role, it no longer needed to remain functional. You will have noted that such objects can evidently be worn by men. Another example of aggrandisement can probably be seen in the rather large and deep conical buttons made of gold-covered shale, another well-known Wessex type, although only 3 graves contain it. Their dimensions make these objects relatively heavy, and if they were to be mounted conventionally as buttons, it would be hard to avoid them drooping forward and causing the costume to ruck. Really tight stitching to a stiff leather garment would impair the button function. My preferred solution is to see them instead being deliberately suspended vertically, rather like a plumb bob, but still potentially serving as a garment or belt fastening. The suspension cord could be passed through a loop in the manner shown. This interpretation makes sense of the decorated bases of 2 of the 3 cones. You can also see that the side decoration is focused on the broadest part, away from the apex, which, if pointing downwards, would be least visible to the onlooker. The way more standard V-board buttons functioned also deserves attention. Some certainly were clothes fasteners, as implied, for example, by their arrangement down the chest of the male Butterwick, and you see the Butterwick buttons top right. But Ian Shepherd's detailed study of the type argued not only for use on a variety of items of clothing, but for other uses as well. Most importantly for the present discussion is his suggestion that some belonged to bead sets. For example, it is usually accepted that they were terminal fasteners for necklaces if, as at Deeping St. Nicholas, they were just one among a set of beads. When in multiple, however, the suggestion is that they were freely strung effectively as beads, as at Middleton Moor, although one should not give too much credence to Bateman's quirky reconstruction in toto. A more recently excavated set of conical buttons from Ingleby Barwick, Cleveland, was also at the neck of a female skeleton. When used in this way, I think they are most likely to have had a backing of leather or fabric to prevent awkward twisting of the conical forms. Mounted thus, they would have made chokers or lower slung collars, a bit like a bossed lunula. We only have to turn to the mould cape to see conical buttons represented in this necklace mode. Skeuomorphically represented in the embossed gold are a number of rows of these conical ornaments. I've arrowed those ones. They are interspersed with a variety of other skeuomorphic forms in an astonishingly intense portrayal of strings of beads interleaved with folds of cloth. Of course, by using sheet gold to imitate these bead strings, the craftsperson had a great advantage. He or she could, if highly skilled in the art of embossing, achieve far more subtlety in juxtaposition and precision of design than could possibly be held by an actual strung necklace. The invention of the spacer plate necklace had, though, already gone some way to creating more fixity of bead positions. The design of the mould cape, which is best dated to period 3 or a little later, clearly cannot have come out of a contextual vacuum. It reflects the kinds of bead forms current in the early Bronze Age. One can find likely prototypes for all the boss shapes. This is seen in the panel in the bottom right of the slide. But interestingly, pyramidal beads are rather rare in this country, and the half drums only roughly matched. The myriad beads are embossed onto a single sheet of gold, interspersed, as I've said, with folds of cloth. So they had, in a sense, become embodied into the fabric of the garment. In this sense, then, the bosses are spangles, being part of the garment. Yet meanwhile they mimic free-running strings of beads. The extensive skeuomorphism seen in the mould cape is of course seen in simpler form on some other ornaments, mainly sheet bronze and sheet gold armlets, as seen classically at Melfort, Masterton and Lockington in Britain, and Whitfield in Ireland, and one or two other sites. Aside from plain ribbing, the only motif on this series of armlets is that of the fusiform beads that are such a regular component of the jet jewellery set of northern Britain. It is perhaps no coincidence then that a rare chased design, seemingly representing a string of beads on a neckring from Garten Slack, also depicts this particular bead form, the fusiform bead. Garten Slack actually brings us back to the matter of gender associations for ornaments. The poorly preserved crouched skeleton there was also accompanied by my icon bronze dagger. And although not sexed, the left side burial position of the corpse is entirely in keeping with male dagger bearers of this period. So while ornament-dominant graves may have predominantly female associations after period 1, it should never be assumed that this was a universal law. Here are some other examples. The trinket-adorned skeleton at Tara, County Meath, has been identified as male, although it is an adolescence of only about 15 years. So too has the much older individual cremated at Beth Branwen Burial H. It is noteworthy that these are at some distance from the Wessex concentration of mixed material beadery, of which more anon, thus posing the question, were different rules applied to the placing of beads with the dead in these regions? Another male-associated bead set is worth mentioning is that from Snail Down. As at Tara, this was a young man, about 16 to 18 years. Otherwise seemingly in reasonable health, he had suffered for some years from a severe tumour in the left eye orbit. This could have caused a serious affliction, and it is not unlikely that it prevented this youth from functioning in the way expected of coming-of-age men. Might this have led to his community recategorizing his gender? Occasional context lacking skeletal remains can lead to unanswerable questions relating to gender. For example, at Masterton, embossed armlets and a jet necklace were in the same kist as a flat bronze dagger. Here, in the absence of surviving skeletal remains, Audrey Henschel raised the possibility that the kist had actually accommodated 2 individuals, one of each sex, and that looks plausible on the distribution of the objects. At Lockington too, embossed armlets and dagger occurred together, but this was a hoard, not a grave, so quite different principles may well have been responsible for its composition. But these are exceptions, and we should get back to the larger corpus of female ornament-rich graves. Although bone has not survived in many of the northern kist burials with ornament sets, sometimes we are more fortunate, as with this lovely lady from the tiny island of Inchmarnock, just off Bute. I have it on good authority that she should be addressed as the Queen of the Inch. Not only do we have a superb jet plate, spacer plate necklace, but also radiocarbon confirmation of a period 2 date. The grave uncovered almost a century earlier on the opposite side of Bute at Mount Stuart, and shown in this slide, also had a female skeleton surviving. Another excellent example is the grave from Ingleby Barwick in Cleveland, which I mentioned earlier. It contained a crouched inhumation of a young adult woman on her right side, as at Mount Stuart. As well as the 17 jet conical buttons mooted as forming a choker, she was accompanied by 2 bronze armlets, one simple, the other a multi-ribbed bar, 1 stone bead, a good number of tubular bronze beads, and more of jet, mainly of disc form. You can see that grave too has yielded a fairly early radiocarbon date. Having set out some of the general points on the nature of ornaments and their gender associations in burials, I'm now going to consider in a little more detail various kinds of bead sets primarily used for necklaces, but also for accompanying bracelets. The most striking bead sets of this period are the classic spacer plate necklaces of jet or amber. We have already seen some examples, and they have long been appreciated for their complex stringing. Note the end-on view in the bottom left corner. Long been appreciated for their complex stringing, for their clever design, and for their stylistic relationship to gold lunulae. But the unambiguous unity of design of these necklaces, or at least some of them, and the impressive sophistication in their manufacture has overshadowed other important categories of bead sets. Much of my focus today is on the processes of bead exchange that have been explored recently in the literature, for this has profound social implications. One important category for this discussion are the bead sets that are both multi-type and multi-material, the ones that Alison Sheridan has dubbed composite necklaces, as illustrated in this slide by the Oldbourne group on the right, which has various beads of shale, stone, faience and fossil. In fact, by period 3, the range of materials available was quite wide: gold, bronze, tin, jet, lignite, shale, amber, wood, bone, shell, fossil, calcite and other stones. And these appear in various combinations in composite sets. We also need to review other categories of bead set. Thanks to Alison's work, we can recognise single-type bead strings, beads of just one type, most often disc beads and usually of shale or jet, as illustrated by Weaverthorpe and Folkestone. And then there are the sets with just two types of beads, such as Eglingham, some of which look like planned compositions. These different ways of compositing a necklace or bracelet involve different breadths of craft skill, different techniques of stringing, and different strategies of material procurement. They suggest distinct approaches that may have distinct social as well as craft connotations. We need to be conscious that we are dealing with several centuries of ornament production and use, and some differences of approach could be due to change over time. Disc bead sets are the earliest to appear during the Chalcolithic, but they then continue right through this era. The emergence of crescentic jet necklaces can probably be dated to early in period 2, having been inspired, as we've said, by the gold lunulae. In their near intact form, they may have continued into period 3, and components of them undoubtedly circulated for longer. Intact or large portions of the Wessex amber counterparts, just 4 known, should belong to period 3, with intimations that they might start at the very beginning, around the 20th century. Indeed, a recently discovered amber spacer necklace from Shaw Cairn on the western edge of the peak, I showed a picture in the last lecture, is dated to period 2, but it is significant, as Alison has pointed out, that this one relates stylistically to the jet style rather than to the classic Wessex style. Composite bead sets, you can see at the bottom of this chart, on the other hand, which I'm now going to discuss, seem to span periods 3 to 4, perhaps with an emphasis on the latter end. As we shall see, there could be a cause-effect explanation for this. The mixture of types and materials, with little by way of repetition, makes composite bead sets look unplanned relative to spacer plate necklaces and some of the other types. It was perhaps more a question of contrived assembly rather than crafted design. There is, if you like, an attitude of kleptania. This idea has arisen through Anne Woodward and Alison Sheridan's independent studies of composite necklaces. They suggest that different components arrived in the final composition by means of multiple and varied pathways. Now, one could explain this in terms of mourner's choice, the mourner's choice hypothesis we discussed in Lecture 1. The miscellaneous character of the bead sets being the product of diverse contributions by mourners at the funeral. But Anne and Alison suggest instead that they were really life compositions, different components having been acquired by an individual over their lifetime from diverse sources, typically as heirlooms from deceased members of the previous generation. As such, the bead sets were perpetually compositions in the making, until such time as they came to be fossilized by their inclusion in a burial. In fact, the heirloom hypothesis does not exclude an element of selection in the funerary process. Instead, it actually promotes it. For it follows that any ornament set worn by a newly deceased person would be open to the possibility of being divided at the funeral to allow some components to be passed on to descendants. So we cannot assume that the buried bead assemblage was ever the complete set possessed shortly before death. Presumably, though, sufficient was retained in the grave to ensure appropriate presentation to the other world. So far, my diagrams have tacitly assumed that bead acquisitions were either newly manufactured or inherited. This overlooks the strong possibility that exchange would also have been taking place between living members of a peer group, perhaps, for example, on an interregional scale to cement alliances and facilitate exchange transactions. Thus, person-to-person transfers of beads might have been another ongoing process not solely triggered by the deaths of influential females. The implication of these various modes of exchange and transfer is that these seemingly trivial trinkets had great symbolic value. They may have resonated with passed down references to their previous wearers. In the process, they speak of special social connections. They are a materialization of the particular social networking that underpinned these early Metal Age societies. But it seems that social connections were not materialized in this fashion from the outset. We can identify an early phase when bead strings of unitary design were the norm, giving way to a later phase in which compositing eclipsed coherent design in some regions or communities. Alison Sheridan has shown that the composite bead set is predominantly found in Wessex, with the diaspora of finds beyond. These outlying finds might well reflect important intergroup connections forged through some economic need or social alliance. Or some might even represent migrant individuals emanating from the core area. Although it is the composite bead sets that take the heirloom process to excess, the other ornament types were far from immune to it. One of the central planks of Anne's original hypothesis was that most finds of the amber spacer plates were small fragments, as at the Nows of Trotty, or otherwise were collections of beads far too limited to even begin to construct a crescentic necklace. This was true also of many jet examples, such as those buried in a pit at Helperthorpe, or with a burial at Holwick and Tees. The breaking up and recomposition of spacer plate necklaces is also implied by the discovery by Alison Sheridan and Mary Davis that the Melfort example in fact comprises parts of two separate necklaces. So complex things are going on elsewhere too. They are just manifested in different ways according to regional preferences. So the recycling of necklace components may involve different types of materials and perhaps different strategies. It may be hypothesized that a common incentive was that the components were imbued with the legendary power of the individual represented by the original necklace. In some cases, that individual had died and become an exemplary ancestor through high-profile burial, as I illustrate schematically here. The possession of such components could have become ever more influential in refining the character, status and connections of the new possessor. And because this process resulted in unplanned compositions of beads associated with later generations of influential females, it could easily have set in train a reinforcing circle. It became desirable to composite your ornament set to reflect your social and ancestral connections, and thus your importance. In this process, the beads are in effect being taken to represent parts of the person or persons with whom they are associated. They are the material extensions of the person in the way discussed in anthropology and taken up vigorously by Joe Brooke with reference to Bronze Age society. Once we start to identify particular material categories in this way, it blurs the boundary between token pieces of the body and token pieces of critical, intimately associated artifacts. We have already talked about the reworking of human skeletal remains, including their incorporation into newer burials. So the transfer of a token ornament to new ownership or to a new context, such as a grave, may be analogous to transfer of disarticulated human bones. One should not perhaps go so far as to suggest they were viewed as interchangeable materials in such transactions, but they could have readily been seen as parallel processes working towards the same broad objectives, and differing substantively only in the context that dictated the particular material expression, bead or bone. Both are concerned to reference past individuals through token relics, and thus help materialize the interpersonal relationships considered most vital to establishing ancestry and intergroup affiliations. Through such means, the importance of the buried person in this early Metal Age world view could be specified to the other world. This communicative role may have been more central to funerary practice than any desire to offer riches as such. Before we leave composite necklaces, I want to mention three unusual examples that might represent another strand in the emergence of the category. They are the Central Wessex grave groups from Wilsford G7 and G8 and the Manton Barrow, each distinguished by a unique combination of specialised beads and pendants involving a variety of exotic materials, especially amber, gold and shale. Some of the objects have been argued to represent distant places or time. So, for example, the halberd pendants are seen to be representations of halberds with metal-bound hafts of the Thisworld in Saxo-Thuringia, British and Irish halberds being extinct by this stage. Again, the small notched disc from Wilsford G8 seems to be an attempt to represent in miniature a gold lunula, albeit crudely. It is tiny. Meanwhile, the battle axe bead from Wilsford G7 imitates the band type of Ireland and Scotland. Such inclusions could have been essential qualifications of a person, told of particular interregional or ancestral links, perhaps even indicated their place of origin. These three graves can all be dated to period 3 on typological grounds, and may have been an early source of inspiration, helping to fuel the fetish for composite necklaces in Wessex. Before concluding, I want to take a look at amber-bearing burials of periods 3 to 4. This is obviously an artificially ring-fenced group, but it provides a variety of cross-associations to ornaments of other materials, and at the same time it straddles the composite unitary divide. Virtually all amber-yielding graves of these two periods lie in southern Britain, and it has been recognised for some time that they are dense in Wessex and even denser in the Stonehenge environs. It is easier, in fact, to represent the latter concentration instead as a single blob. A number of the finds outside Wessex are though, the result of more recent excavations in areas of high destruction and historically poor barrow exploration. So the density in some areas outside Wessex is undoubtedly underrepresented relative to those within. Many of the contexts shown have very few amber pieces, but a small number have very large quantities. 6 graves, represented by the large star, yielded over 60 pieces, and in one case over 1,000 beads. That's Upton Lovell, the Upton Lovell find modelled in the inset picture. And there are a further 11 with between 15 and 50 beads. That's the slightly smaller star. If we add 3 other sites with relatively large objects of amber, the triangles along the south coast, we can see that contexts yielding amber in some quantity are actually relatively well represented outside of Wessex. Here is the Wessex concentration in more detail, and I'm only drawing your attention really today to the 4 amber spacer plate necklaces that were either complete or represented by large portions, and I picked these out in black. Finds are again shown against the national grid, so we have 100 kilometres across the base. Although from one fairly small region, they are actually not clustered, those 4, as Stephen Shannon recognised many years ago. Lake is just south of Stonehenge, Upton Lovell in the Wiley Valley, another is on the Deverell Downs, and Oakley is on Cranbourne Chase. The spacing is between 12 and 25 kilometres. There is a distinct sense of 4 separate communities having got the urge to acquire and later bury one of these exotic and elaborate amber necklaces. It has been deduced that these necklaces were actually made locally in Wessex, presumably by craftsmen either drawn from or instructed in the jet manufacturing zone, for it was this zone that had first developed the requisite skills. It is interesting that if we turn to the Norfolk find of Little Cressingham, where some beads have specific Wessex parallels, there is actually no evidence for spacer plates. The broad objective of producing an impressive array of amber beads may have been the same, but the precise mode of composition was locally determined. In the case of the mould grave, we sadly only know that there were a large number of amber beads. The single survivor cannot possibly tell us whether they were all the same or not. Back to Wessex. Was the use of amber rather than jet or gold a deliberate choice, thereby creating the crescentic style of neck ornament in a contrasting but equally precious and magical material? Although there is a strong association between amber and gold in the graves here, the gold in each Wessex grave is always very limited in quantity. The region apparently failed to attract gold lunulae, or if it did, it melted them down to make a larger number of thinner, smaller, but highly crafted gold covers. Likewise, Wessex seems not to have procured jet spacer necklaces, to judge from the relatively few jet pieces found. But the procurement of sufficient amber for such a complex artifact was no less a feat than obtaining gold or jet, and they could even have replicated the crescentic necklace in Kimmeridge shale. It must have taken persistent long-term scouring of the east coast of England, or more likely importation of the raw amber directly from across the North Sea. So I think this really does favour deliberation in the choice of material. In the course of events, however, it would seem that the supply of amber was not sustainable, or was highly erratic over the longer term. Very few amber spacer plate necklaces are known, and their period of manufacture was likely short-lived. One possible reason for amber supply to central Wessex diminishing is its progressive appropriation by the southern English coastal belt. This zone was critical in the acquisition of amber from the shores of the North Sea by means of the maritime network. And it so happens it has a respectable number of amber finds, including some made from sizable lumps of the raw material, the 2 cups from Hove and Clandon, and the dagger pommel from Hamilton Down. This could have exacerbated the problems for a material that was anyway difficult to obtain on a regular basis. If there was difficulty in creating new unitary amber ornaments in central Wessex on any scale, this could have had direct pragmatic consequences. Amber had clearly become a desirable, highly valued material, and this would certainly be a driving force towards keeping bits in circulation, smaller and smaller subsets of the original grand conceptions. If it was still desirable to present certain females with a rich string of beads, it was now necessary to diversify and augment the amber. Gold, as we have seen, was equally scarce, and silver almost unavailable. This left other precious materials: shale, jet, and faience. This explanatory scenario might actually provide the background for the vigorous uptake of faience technology in Wessex, but not exclusively there, when it was introduced from the continent during the course of period 3. In this histogram I simply compare the quantity of amber beads in greys without faience, the lilac bars, to those which included it, the plum-coloured bars. It shows in the rightmost column that the very large finds of amber lack any faience, as do most of the fairly large finds, that is, with between 13 and 60 beads. This suggests that large quantities of amber are mainly early deposits, and amber was generally scarcer once faience had been adopted. It could be argued that the decline in the use of amber was a choice. It might be argued that the decline in the use of amber was a choice, more mixed bead sets instead being sought, but this would not readily explain the esteem in which amber relics were apparently still held. There are 2 features of faience use that mark Wessex out from the rest of Britain. Production in Wessex seems to have been directed entirely to a single bead type, the segmented bead. Other forms of faience bead were the preserve of other regions. Moreover, when it came to stringing these faience beads, in Wessex they were almost always combined with beads of other materials, usually in the composite strings we have just discussed. This pattern contrasts with the rest of Britain where, as Alison Sheridan has noted, in addition to scattered examples of composite strings, a number of finds from Shawmore in Devon in the south to Findhorn Murray in the north contain strings of faience alone. A few of the finds in question are close enough to the jet zone of the east coast to pose the question, why were they not in composition with jet? Note there are 2 of these faience-only strings just hugging the edge of my Wessex sphere. This is further evidence, I think, that restricting to a single material or alternatively opting for multi-material were deliberate, socially guided choices. Perhaps they were related to notions of what ornamentation most befitted the dead subject's reception in the other world, and this in itself may have been one and the same thing as the living community's view on ornamental perfection. So to summarise, early ornaments were fairly simple types to produce, although already varied in material and form. Growth in the quantity of metal in circulation during the Chalcolithic led to more impressive metal ornaments. A few in copper, but gold was quickly preferred and standardised into the crescentic neckered ornament we know as the lunula. It was probably the inventiveness of the jet workers of the Whitby area who were initially producing simple bead forms that led quickly to more sophisticated design in these body ornaments. Soon after, metal workers in central and northern Britain developed impressive embossed ornaments in gold and bronze respectively. These culminated later in the astounding masterpiece of the Mould Cape. The meaning of ornaments, however, was never static, and I postulate that a combination of erratic amber supply and a growing desire to represent social networks in the beadery worn by influential women led to the phenomenon of composite necklaces with their varied materials and bead forms. So I need to return to the original question I posed. Can we determine what the rich funerary adornment of women from period 2 onwards actually represents? An informal review of skeletal reports shows that females of all ages from puberty upwards are represented. There are individuals as young as their teens, as at Shorncote with a bronze armlet, though sexing may not always be reliable at these sorts of ages. The cremated remains of a young woman of 18 to 25 at Findhorn Murray was accompanied by those of a neonatal infant, these conceivably resulting from complications at the birth. Yet she had the largest set of faience beads yet known from a burial in Britain. By way of contrast, a woman with many beads at Shrewton 5J was judged to be elderly. There is no obvious focus, for example, on mature adults. Of course, if those buried with ornamental finery simply acquired a certain rank through marriage, they could be of any age from puberty upwards. The age profile is probably not going to help with my question. It is, I suppose, feasible that there was some critical change in the structure of society at the Chalcolithic Early Bronze Age transition, which resulted in the elevation of some women to a higher perceived rank than had formerly been permitted. This might, for example, tie in with the need to service an ever-growing exchange network, marriage partners, theoretically of either sex, being potentially one of the prime commodities of exchange. If so, the female sex came to be revalued almost incidentally in the course of necessary growth in interregional exchange. Moreover, communities across Britain seem to have taken pride in their most elevated women to the extent that they wished to promote them amongst the ancestors. But here I would add a cautionary. Period 2 also witnessed acceleration of the diversification of burial modes that began in the later Chalcolithic, a process I have previously dubbed the fission horizon. Given this trajectory, it's not impossible that an already existing category of female might have suddenly come to be seen as a choice subject for presentation to the other world. Once some communities made this leap, the ever-persuasive force of emulation could easily account for widespread acceptance of the principle. I come back to the step change in ostentation and complexity of ornaments, the one I outlined earlier. Whether females were revalued or not, it is difficult to believe that the marked change of balance between the trinketed male burials of period 1 and the exotically bedecked female burials thereafter did not have some basis in social change. Although there are obviously problems of partiality with respect to the death personae, we can probably safely assume these reflected in some measure their respective costume sets in life. And from this perspective, women were certainly made to look and feel more important in both this world and the next. We've covered a fairly wide gamut of evidence today relating to specific burial modes defined by rites and artefact accompaniments. There is much else I haven't had time to cover, but which adds further layers of complexity to the picture of death presentations and inferred social realities. Tomorrow I shall attempt to draw some broader conclusions from my case studies, but before I get there, I will be taking another deviation away from the immediate funerary realm, and taking a look at the fascinating life cycle and symbolic charge of axe heads. At first sight, this may seem to be somewhat irrelevant to my main thesis, but I assure you, it's not.